I oppose the bill. I guess you get that. Mr. Speaker,
I figured that out.
I ask unanimous consent that the remainder of my time be controlled by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady.
Without objection. How much time did you use? 4.5. The chair would advise that there's now a single manager on the Democratic side of the aisle, and the combined time now controlled by Mr. Brady is 19.5 minutes. Mr. Roscom has 7.5 minutes. Mr. Lundgren has 3. And so maybe to even things up, the chair would recognize Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to yield 6 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 359, a bill summarily repealing our system of public funding for presidential elections. The process by which this bill has been brought to the floor, no hearings, no committee consideration, no markup, no deliberation, is the opposite of responsible legislating. It contradicts everything the Republican majority committed to a mere 3 weeks ago. The process is atrocious. The substance is worse. This repeal bill would destroy one of the proudest and most successful examples of reform that followed the Watergate scandal. Have we forgotten what the Watergate scandal was about? The committee to re-elect the president, fueled by huge quantities of corporate cash, paying for criminal acts, otherwise subverting the American electoral system. The hallmark of the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, enacted in response to Watergate at a time when public confidence in the government was dangerously low, the hallmark was our voluntary program of public financing for presidential elections. To this day, this innovative reform stands as the flagship of public financing systems used in the United States and one of the greatest steps we've taken to bring transparency and accountability to our electoral system. The Supreme Court, in affirming the constitutionality of the system, noted its basic purposes, and I quote, "To reduce the deleterious influence of large contributions on our political system, to facilitate communication by candidates with the electorate, and to free candidates from the rigors of fundraising." Presidential public financing has worked remarkably well, being utilized in the general election by every Republican and Democratic presidential nominee from 1976 through 2004, and by John McCain in 2008. Although in recent years the need for modernization has become evident. Perhaps the best example of the program's success is President Ronald Reagan, who participated in the presidential public financing system in all 3 of his presidential campaigns, 1976, 1980, 1984. In his 1976 primary campaign, Reagan had less than $44,000 in campaign money at the end of January 76, while his opponent, incumbent President Ford, had 15 times more cash on hand. The $1 million in public funds that Reagan received in January, the $1.2 million that he received in February, were essential in allowing him to continue his campaign. Reagan was once again short of cash at the end of March and was allowed to continue as a result of a diffusion of public money which matched small private contributions. This illuminates one way that public financing has worked in both parties. It has often benefited candidates who challenge the party establishment. In later elections, due to his broad base of supporters throughout the nation, Reagan was able to capitalize on his small donor fundraising capacity to accrue substantial amounts of public money. In fact, even in '84, when he was seeking re-election without significant opposition in his own party, President Reagan raised about 60% of his campaign funds from small donors, and as a result received $9.7 million in matching funds. This was the maximum amount of public money a primary candidate could receive in accordance with the law at that time, and to this date, President Reagan is the only candidate ever to reach that public funding primary campaign maximum. My colleagues, the Reagan case is merely illustrative of the positive effects that public financing has had in both parties, at both the primary and general election stages. It also highlights the system's focus on small donations rather than big bucks from large contributors. This is no free ride. This is no willy-nilly spending program. All primary candidates must seek the support of thousands of small donors, and only then do they receive matching public funds. Today one could wish not for this Republican juggernaut, flying in the face of the positive history of this program, flying in the face of prior Republican support, flying in the face of responsible legislating. One could wish for a bipartisan effort to repair the system, to restore its effectiveness. I don't know of any policy challenge that exemplifies the maxim, mend it, don't end it, better than this one. Yesterday, Congressman Van Hollen and I reintroduced a bill, H.R. 414, that would do just that, and the White House has cooperated in formulating this bill. It would modernize the presidential public financing system and again make it an attractive and viable option for presidential candidates. Our bill would bring available funds into line with the increased cost of campaigns, adjust the program to the front-loaded primary calendar, and enhance the role of small donors further. It also would remove public funding of political conventions, as their roles indeed have changed since the system was first instated. This bill has been carefully designed. It deserves deliberation and debate through the normal committee process in this body. At a time when confidence in government is low, assumptions of government corruption are high, why is the new majority trying to return us to the dark days that preceded Watergate? Why would we even want to contemplate such a thing? Let's instead restore and improve our public financing system and move on to real solutions to put our nation's house in order.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield 1 minute to our majority leader, I might just take 15 seconds to yield to myself to say, when I find myself on the floor listening to my colleagues on the other side declaring Ronald Reagan to be the patron saint of Democratic Party ideas, I am bemused a bit, because I served here when Ronald Reagan was president, and I don't recall those same words at that time. However, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader, Mr. Cantor.
Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Cantor.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, over the past 2 years, the legislative schedule of this House was dominated by spending money, not cutting spending. But after the people voiced their displeasure in November, the discussion in this town is now focused on rolling back the unchecked growth of government and federal expenditures. Our majority is dedicated to cut and grow, cutting spending and job-destroying regulations, growing private sector jobs in the economy. Yesterday, we directed the Budget Committee Chairman to set spending levels so we return non-defense discretionary spending to 2008 levels or below. Today, the American public, through the UCUT program, has put on the chopping block an example of unnecessary government waste. Specifically, this bill would eliminate the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, an outdated mechanism that provides federal tax dollars to candidates in presidential primaries in the form of matching funds and general elections and subsidies for the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Eliminating this program would save taxpayers $617 million over 10 years and require candidates and political parties to rely on private contributions rather than tax dollars. In times when government has no choice but to do more with less, voting to end the Presidential Election Campaign Fund should be a no-brainer. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the Republicans will accomplish with this legislation to upend the presidential campaign finance system is to drown out the voice of the people and to give more power, not less, to their well-heeled special interests. Actually, this repeal bill is the beginning of the end of any hope for a system of public financing for all elections in this country. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not surprised. After all, the majority largely owe their unprecedented spending levels in the last election thanks to the Citizens United decision that turned on the spigot of anonymous unaccountable corporate cash. And in keeping with the spirit of secrecy and lack of transparency, it's somehow fitting that this bill comes to the floor without any hearings, without any committee referral, without full debate or deliberation. We have a deeply corrupt campaign system, Mr. Speaker. Special interest money is having a corrosive effect on our democracy, eating away at the people's confidence in their government and their elected representatives. The one beacon of light in this system is the public financing of presidential campaigns. It is, I would remind everyone, a voluntary system. Americans must choose to opt in on their tax returns. It has served the country well, a limited expense. It needs updating. It does not need to be dismantled. We need more public financing in all of our federal elections, not less. H.R. 359 goes in exactly the wrong direction. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 5 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schock.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, I read articles about President Obama's re-election campaign plans on raising upwards of $750 million. There is no system of public financing for our presidential elections that can accommodate anywhere near that level of spending. That is why I believe the President's strong opposition to legislation abolishing a system the President himself found unworkable in reality is profoundly hypocritical. Putting out a statement of administration policy that states repealing the public financing system would, quote, force many candidates into an endless cycle of fundraising at the expense of engagement with the voters on the issues, and to place a premium on access to large donors or special interest support, narrowing the field of otherwise worthy candidates, end quote. What incredible audacity. This is like the proverbial arsonist child who kills his parents by setting their house on fire and then appeals for sympathy by exclaiming he is an orphan. The President's statement is absolutely saying one thing while doing the opposite. A New York Times editorial on January 24th of this year said, quote, Eric Cantor is targeting for extinction the publicly subsidized presidential campaign finance system adopted in the wake of the Watergate scandals, end quote. Wrong. It was President Obama who killed it and made a mockery of public financing of presidential campaigns with his arrogant pressing of self-advantage. His unprecedented move to decline public financing for the first and only time since the adoption of this system. In disparaging the majority leader, the Times went on to say that, quote, we suspect his real motive is to give an even bigger voice to big money contributors in presidential campaigns, end quote. Once again, the record needs correcting. No campaign in American history had more maximum donors at $30,400 per person than Obama for America. Much has been made of that committee's legendary prowess in generating small donors over the Internet. But that committee has also had a record-shattering haul among big donors, bundlers, and influence peddlers. But such is the right for Mr. Obama as a candidate in America. However, when he alone has refused to participate in public financing of a general election for a presidential campaign, his protestations ring rather hollow. No one has made more of the system operationally obsolete than Barack Obama. Actions do speak louder than words. And Barack Obama alone has refused to participate on the level playing field that existed in publicly financed presidential general election campaign in history. It was not that the system was antiquated that forced Barack Obama to break a very sanctimonious campaign promise to participate in public financing. It was his decision to put expediency over his express support for the Democrat mantra of public financing. It was all about a ruthless pressing of self-advantage. Despite a core campaign theme of promising to rise above self-interested politics. Today we will hear about, on the floor, measures to address the inadequacies of the system and the need for repair the system. First, I want to note an earlier New York Times editorial on June 20th, 2008, which stated, quote, Senator Russ Feingold, the ranking authority on campaign finance reform, rightly points out that while the primary cycle's public matching subsidies are broken and need updating for inflation, quote, the system for the general election is not broken. Secondly, I ask my Democratic colleagues this. Have any of you received the specifics of what it would take to change the law that would cause President Barack Obama's campaign to abide by public spending limits in the general election for 2012? Because without those specifics, this debate is not grounded in the reality that the incumbent president has zero intention of giving up his gargantuan financial advantage in his re-election campaign by opting out of one of the most perfect systems of public financing we could possibly adopt. I ask the supporters of public financing for presidential campaigns, are you willing to adopt a system that makes it mandatory for all candidates to participate in the system? And can you unequivocally pledge that the President's re-election committee will agree to be bound by your new system? And if not, I would suggest you are preaching at the wrong end of Pennsylvania Avenue. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair would advise members that Mr. Roscom still has 2.5 minutes, Mr. Lundgren 1 3/4 minutes, Mr. Brady 11.5 minutes. The chair would further advise that ascribing motivations or intentions to the President of the United States or another member of the United States Congress are inappropriate, and the chair would recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor to have our leader, Democratic leader, General Leader from California, Ms. Pelosi, for 1 minute.
Minority leaders recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Thank you for your leadership, Mr. Brady, and participating in this important discussion as fundamental as our democracy is on the floor today. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge this Congress to focus on our #1 priority, the creation of jobs. This is a priority for the American people, and for this Congress, we should be focusing on it. That was the message we heard last night from President Obama, just on this floor, as I say, just last night, who called on us to out-educate, out-innovate, and out-build the rest of the world. But instead of talking about job creation, this legislation we debate today will not create jobs, will not reduce the deficit, and will not strengthen the middle class. And those are the standards we should apply to any legislation that comes to the floor. Instead, it will put American elections more squarely into the hands of special interest. 1 year ago, the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United opened the floodgates to unlimited, uninhibited, undisclosed special interest spending in our elections and unlimited special interest influence over our public policy debate. In response to the Citizens United ruling, Democrats worked to restore transparency, fairness, accountability to our political progress. Last Congress, with bipartisan support, the House passed the Disclose Act to require corporations to stand by and donors to stand by their ad. Stand by your ad. Why are you running and hiding? And to keep foreign-owned entities from participating in our elections. But Senate Republicans blocked Disclose. Even though it came out of the House with bipartisan support, Senate Republicans blocked Disclose from even receiving an up or down vote, and now House Republicans are perpetuating a sneak attack on campaign finance reform. The result was clear in the last election. Special interest groups spent tens of millions of dollars more in the 2010 election than ever before. Again, undisclosed, without identification. There's a reason they don't want it disclosed. First of all, if the public knew who was paying for those ads, they would realize that their own personal interests were not being served but the special interest. That's our experience in California, where we had a special interest initiative placed on the ballot by outside oil companies. And the strongest statement against the initiative was to see the disclosure at the bottom of the ad as to who was funding it. That spoke more eloquently to the fact that it was not in the people's interest, and the initiative was defeated. Today, by eliminating the Presidential Election Fund, as this election would do, opens the door for foreign-owned entities and large corporations to enjoy an even greater role in the funding of political campaigns. In the past, members from both sides of the aisle have supported legislation to reform, to eliminate, not eliminate, the public financing system. We should come together to ensure that the American people are heard, that they are heard, and that they are not drowned out by special interest dollars. In our democracy, God bless us, our founders, for establishing it, voters determine the outcome of our elections. That's the way it should be. Special interest should not be determining the outcome of our elections. 1 year after the Supreme Court's decision undermined that fundamental American value, let's come together to fight on behalf of the public interest, to preserve the integrity of our political campaigns, and therefore to strengthen our democracy. And maybe we could, instead of undermining it here today, strengthen our country by creating jobs, by reducing the deficit, by strengthening the middle class, none of which is being done by this legislation. I urge my colleague to oppose this effort to further empower the special interest over the people's interest. I yield back the balance of my time.
The minority leader yields back. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack.
Gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the gentleman for yielding. Last night, just a few seats down from where I stand, I listened to our President say that he would offer his support to eliminate whatever we can honestly afford to do without. I stand here today in this House chamber feeling a little less like a freshman representative of the United States Congress and more like a guy presiding over the People's Choice Awards. There is no better program, in my judgment, that is tailor-made for elimination than this program. In overwhelming fashion, the people of Arkansas, and indeed the people of America, spoke loud and clear last year about the need to reduce spending in this country. The gentleman from Oklahoma talked about the fact that this program does not educate anyone. It doesn't feed anyone. It doesn't produce a mile of interstate highway. The gentleman from California articulated the declining participation in this checkoff program. I don't think there's a better barometer out there for the overwhelming support that the people have for this particular measure. I urge my colleagues to join me today and vote in favor of H.R. 359. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in opposition of H.R. 359. Adopted in the shadows of the Watergate scandal, the public financing of presidential elections eased the burden of fundraising campaigns and lessened the impact of private donations by a small number of wealthy donors. Since 1976, candidates from across the political spectrum have used the public financing program to run for president. Is the system perfect? Absolutely not. The system needs to be reformed, not repealed. I've heard one of my colleagues on the floor mention that our president, President Obama, opted out of this program. That was his choice. I do not think we should be in a position to legislate the American people's choice. That's their choice to opt out or to check that box. I don't think we have the right to do that, nor should we do that. With the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, little over a year ago, we were already well on our way on elections brought to the American people by the highest corporate bidder. If this bill passes, there will be even more incentive for foreign-controlled companies to secretly invest in political causes that could help move American jobs overseas. Companies that outsource jobs will have a very simple message to presidential candidates: support our agenda or face the consequences. This bill takes secret corporate dominance over our elections to the next level. The bill also being considered at the wrong time under the wrong circumstances. Less than 3 weeks ago, the American people were promised an open Congress, a Congress that allowed for open debate, one that allows for open rules. The American people are still waiting. In consideration of this matter, the committee process was completely disregarded. There have been no hearings, no testimony from witnesses either for or against, no markup, no refining the committee or input from experts, zero, none. When we did the Disclosure Act, we had 3 hearings, 17 witnesses. We learned from our witnesses. They gave us their opinion and they gave us education on what they thought pro and con. To bypass that, which we have never done before in our committee, I think is wrong, and we should have had our hearings and let it happen. There's no reason why we have to rush this thing over to the Senate. I would doubt very much if they're sitting there waiting for it. And we could have took our time, did our hearings, which we do in a complete nonpartisan way, and we could have had this thing thrashed out. We could have aired it out. People could have put their amendments in. They could have offered amendments at our committee level, and we could have aired it out perfectly and got much more education and maybe had a chance to reform it for the better. But while reforming the presidential funding system is an important effort which I support, the next presidential election is 2 years away. This bill does not create or save a single job. Zero, none. There is a time and a place for campaign reform. While here might be the place, now is certainly not the time. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and to get back to the important task of putting American people back to work. And, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The chair would advise that. How much time did he use? The gentleman from Pennsylvania still has 8.5 minutes. The majority side has a combined 3¼ minutes. He's reserving. The order of closing would be that the gentleman from Pennsylvania would exhaust time on their side, and then we'll move to the gentleman on the majority side for conclusion. So I turn again to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, it's my pleasure to yield as much time as he may consume. In my opinion, an expert on this matter, Mr. Price.
Gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the gentleman, and I'm pleased to close for our side with a plea to our colleagues that they not dismantle in an irresponsible and summary fashion one of the proudest achievements of post-Watergate political reform in this country. I also can't let pass what Mr. Schock said about our president. Of course we want President Obama. We want all presidential candidates to opt into this system, and I think we've made it about as clear as we possibly could that the bill that Mr. Van Hollen and I have introduced is designed to make it feasible once again for candidates to participate in the public financing system. But Mr. Schock's talk about having it both ways. He comes onto this floor to condemn President Obama for opting out of the system, and then he proposes to abolish the system so that everybody has to opt out. Neither President Obama nor anyone else can participate. The logic of that is just totally escapes me. Of course we want a system that works. We know the system needs to be adjusted, and we have constructive efforts underway to do just that. What we should be doing, instead of having this up or down exercise on the floor today with no committee consideration, is actually undertaking that kind of discussion, that kind of reform, that kind of improvement. You know, there is a bipartisan history here. There's a bipartisan history of supporting this program, a bipartisan history of participating in the program. And that may be out of fashion now. But under the cover of achieving fiscal responsibility, to come in here and abolish one of the proudest and most successful of our reform efforts, I think does a disservice to the new majority and to this House. And it does violate all the pledges we had 3 weeks ago of hearings, committee consideration, markups. None of that. None of that has been done. This is simply an up or down vote, as I say, flying under the banner of fiscal responsibility. So we have a chance. We have a chance to take on this challenge, to mend it, not end it, to make certain that we preserve this reform, but adjust it to the realities of modern campaigning. To simply abolish this, to once again turn over presidential financing to big private and corporate interests, to overlook the abuses, the problems that led to this system in the first place, I think is beneath what we should be about as responsible legislators in this body and in this country. So I ask for members to look at our legislation by which we can indeed repair and rejuvenate this system, and in the meantime to reject this summary attempt to destroy one of the proudest achievements of reform. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair would advise the gentleman from Pennsylvania, you still got 5 minutes left if you want to use it.
Reserve balance of my time, sir.
Well, the majority has indicated that they're prepared to close.
They have no further speakers?
Yeah, I think they're done except to close on each committee. So.
Then I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Who wants to close first? The gentleman from California. Minute and 3/4.
I yield myself all minute and 3/4.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the ranking member of our committee has been very fair in the proceedings that he had with us over the last number of years, and I appreciate that, and we will continue that tradition. We were unable to have any hearings or consideration of this matter before our committee until yesterday, when we finally were told by the minority party as to who they wish to have on our committee. We could not meet as a full committee until we had a complement of both Democrats and Republicans, we having established our side several weeks ago. I'm sorry that happened. We will have plenty of hearings in the future on this and other issues. What has the current system that we are hearing the other side defend, what has it given us? It's given us Lyndon LaRouche, but it would prevent Eugene McCarthy from being a successful presidential candidate. That's what we don't hear. The system works against some people like a Eugene McCarthy, who was a poor fundraiser, but managed to have a number of people who supported him, who gave him large contributions, and yet he was able to change the course of history, bringing down a sitting president and allow for, well, he was called the Pied Piper of the youth vote. So let's understand the complexity of the history of this law. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Chairman, this law has failed us. It has failed the American people. The American people have rendered their judgment. Nearly 93% of the American people who pay taxes have voted no to this system. That ought to give us good guidance as to where we can find savings to bring down our national debt. As I understand it, we're going to have an amendment from the Democratic side of the aisle which causes any money saved here to go to bringing down the debt, and I hope that it comes forward, and I will support it, and I hope we have the support of our colleagues for this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Illinois has a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Chairman, the minority leader was on the floor a couple of minutes ago, and I know the weather situation is urgent. I didn't want to prolong this drama, but it seemed to me to make the argument that this doesn't do anything as it relates to economic growth is just an incredible overstatement. One of the things that we continue to hear, and the President's own debt commission spoke eloquently about the nature of debt and the stifling nature of debt on the economy and the stifling nature of spending on the economy. And here the Congressional Budget Office says, without ambiguity, the Congressional Budget Office says, H.R. 359 would reduce direct spending by $617 million over the 2011 to 2021 period. This is an opportunity for us to take the admonition of the minority leader, to take the admonition of the President, to take the admonition of what the electorate told us in November, and that is to concentrate on ways that we can trim this government, the burden on the taxpayer that adds absolutely no value. There is not one member on this House floor, Mr. Chairman, that has defended the results of this system. I urge passage of this bill.
Gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule for a period not to exceed 5 hours and shall be considered read. No amendments to the bill shall be considered, shall be in order, except those printed in the portion of the congressional record designated for that purpose, and except pro forma amendments for the purposes of debate. Chair would advise, in light of the gentleman from New York's parliamentary inquiry, earlier that the record is available and all members can happily read the amendments that are made and have been pre-printed. Each amendment printed may be offered only by the member who caused it to be printed or a designee and shall be considered as read. Are there any amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Peters of Michigan.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a strong bipartisan agreement that long-term health of our economy necessitates confronting persistent budget deficits and the growing national debt. Democrats and Republicans are able to work together to create balanced budgets in the 1990s, and a similar attempt is needed now. While I appreciate the efforts of the Republican leadership to put forward this specific budget cut, I have serious concerns with eliminating the public campaign financing system. However, if the House is going to vote on this, we owe it to the American people to ensure that the funds are actually used for deficit reduction and not for additional spending. When I was reading the text of this legislation, I was surprised to find that the bill does not make specific provisions for using the remaining money in the presidential election campaign fund to reduce the deficit. This is why I'm putting forward my amendment that will ensure that the $194 million in tax dollars currently sitting in the presidential election campaign fund will be used to reduce the deficit should this legislation become law. As introduced, H.R. 359 would transfer this money to the Treasury's general fund, where it could be dedicated to new spending or lent to government trust funds. My amendment would simply specify that upon transfer to the Treasury, these funds are to be used only for reducing the deficit. This is about sending a message to taxpayers. If we're going to put deficit reduction in a bill's title, then we should make sure the deficit reduction is in the statutory language as well. It is a matter of fact that the bill was introduced simply returns the $195 million in the presidential election campaign fund to the Treasury's general fund. And it is from this fund that most expenditures are made, as well as loans to a number of government trust funds. If we're going to pass a bill to reduce the deficit, let's make sure it actually does that. It is not uncommon or unprecedented to specify funds being returned to the Treasury to be used for deficit reduction. In fact, I'm proud to be a bipartisan co-sponsor of 2 Republican bills introduced this session, one by my colleague from Michigan, Chairman Camp, and Representative Gingrey, that would codify the requirements that unspent funds from a member's representation allowance be used specifically for deficit reduction. This amendment basically uses the same language as in both of those bills by Mr. Camp and Mr. Gingrey. If Congress is going to send a message to taxpayers that cutting spending is a top priority, then let's make sure those recovered funds are actually used to reduce the deficit. My amendment is a common-sense change that ensures that the stated purpose of this bill, deficit reduction, will actually be carried out. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment, wholeheartedly agree and urge its passage.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, gentleman's done with his 5 minutes.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member wish to be recognized on the amendment? The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The gentleman from Michigan.
I'd like to request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on this amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2.
The gentlelady has 2 printed. Could you tell us which one you want to do?
Take up the first amendment.
Which would be 2.
Number 2.
First will be 2. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in the congressional record, offered by Ms. Castor of Florida.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Reserve a point of order against the amendment.
Point of order is reserved. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the Castor Amendment to safeguard the local government security funds that come from the presidential election campaign fund. I know a lot of the debate has been focused on public campaign financing of presidential campaigns, But another important portion of that fund goes to local communities to help them with local security and local law enforcement costs when they host a convention, a political party convention. And we're very proud in my hometown of Tampa to be the host of the 2012 Republican Convention. It's no wonder that the Republicans selected Tampa. It's a wonderful place. We have beautiful beaches. We need the business and the jobs, so we're going to be a very welcoming community. We do conventions very well, and we're very happy that we're going to play host to the Republican Convention. But here are great warning flags going off, because what I hear from my local law enforcement community is that the security costs, especially in the post-9/11 world, are very daunting. They are very concerned with the cost of providing security for the Republican Convention, just like I think any host community would be for any party convention. So what this amendment does, it says, rather than completely do away with this fund, that we will retain the portion that will cover local law enforcement security costs. We are going to need this help. What I understand from my colleagues in Minneapolis after the last convention is that they received over $16 million from this fund to help them cover the cost of security. Yet that wasn't enough to fully cover all the costs. And let me tell you, in this economy right now, in an area where we were hard hit by the recession in 2007, early 2007, our local governments simply don't have the wherewithal to go this extra mile and cover all of these security costs. So what I'm asking through this amendment is we come together in a bipartisan way to cover those local law enforcement costs. Let's not throw out the entire fund. Let's retain this amount or what's left in the fund to go to cover these local security costs. Let's face it, too, this is voluntary. This is the voluntary checkoff on your income tax form that taxpayers all across America can decide if they want to do this or not. This is not something that's mandatory upon all taxpayers across the country. And if folks around the country, if taxpayers want to say voluntarily, we want to help keep big money out of campaigns and we want to help cover local security issues, then we should be following through with that commitment and not eliminating it, not giving them any choice at all. Overall, if the majority will not accept this amendment, since you've raised the point of order and it seems like you don't want to bring it up to a vote, I would urge everyone to vote no on H.R. 359 because it puts in danger dollars that can be used by the City of Tampa, the Tampa Bay area, and other communities for security, transportation, preparation, and other allowable purposes. And this amendment intends to replace the $100 million we spend for security every 4 years with funding from this voluntary fund. If we kill this fund, we're going to be hurting many local communities, such as my hometown of Tampa. The host committee will be way behind the 8 ball, and they're doing a good job, but boy, this was a commitment, this is the law, and you're going to really stick it to them by taking these security funds away. So let's focus on making our community safe when we rally in democracy under our political conventions. At this time, I'll reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
You cannot reserve. She has to use it or lose it. We're under the 5-minute rule.
Well, at this point, since the majority party has offered a point of order, it appears like they're not going to allow this amendment and probably the next one to come up for a vote. So because the majority has raised a point of order to prevent a vote on my amendment, I reluctantly ask unanimous consent to withdraw both of my amendments, which would have safeguarded our security funds for local law enforcement.
Well, without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the bill? Are there further amendments to the bill? Does she have one? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in the congressional record, offered by Ms. Saugus of Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order against the amendment.
Point of order is reserved. Gentlelady from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my intention to withdraw, however reluctantly, the amendment, but I would like to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for giving me this opportunity to discuss what I believe is a critically important issue for our democracy. My amendment is straightforward. Entities that receive federal funds may not use those funds, be they bailouts, earmarks, grants, or payments for contracts, toward the election or defeat of a presidential candidate. I understand what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle hope to accomplish with the underlying bill today. They want to protect taxpayer dollars. Saving taxpayer dollars is a noble goal, particularly in these tough economic times. Unfortunately, this bill eliminates the voluntary fund that taxpayers elect to put toward campaign financing and does nothing about the much larger share of taxpayer dollars that can now go to campaign financing with no say from taxpayers. If we are truly serious about protecting taxpayer dollars, it is these dollars we should be concerned with. We should ensure that corporations and other entities receiving taxpayer money cannot turn around and use that same money to finance presidential campaigns. The Supreme Court in Citizens United allowed corporations to have unlimited influence in elections. It removed long-standing protections that prevented corporations from making large contributions to candidates, drowning out the voices of everyday Americans trying to participate in our democracy. In the wake of Citizens United, public financing of presidential elections is all the more important to ensure a level playing field for candidates running for office and to preserve the voice of the American taxpayer. By eliminating the presidential campaign fund, my colleagues across the aisle would increase the influence of special interests in the elections, leaving presidential candidates beholden to large private contributions. If my colleagues insist on eliminating this important and completely voluntary fund, let us at least make sure that corporations receiving taxpayer money through bailouts, earmarks, and other federal funds are not able to then use these taxpayer funds towards influencing presidential elections. Let us level the playing field and protect all American voters by ensuring that these large private contributions to political candidates aren't funded using taxpayer money. Mr. Speaker, I reluctantly ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the bill? The gentlelady from Wisconsin have an amendment? Gentlelady from Wisconsin?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me.
Well, do you have an amendment?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in the congressional record, offered by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order against the amendment.
Point of order is reserved. The gentlelady from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you so much. The Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission created an uninhibited voice for special interest spending in our elections and unlimited corporate speech in our public policy debate. Special interests were heard loud and clear this past election cycle at the tune of $281.6 million, almost 5 times greater than the previous midterm election of 2006. By eliminating the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, where everyday Americans can have their voices heard, special interest groups will be able to shout from the top of the mountain and dominate presidential elections even more. Currently, between 7 and 8% of Americans choose to direct $3 of their tax liability to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. My amendment is simple. Instead of directing that amount, that $3 of tax liability, by checking that box, that citizens would be able to check that box and voluntarily make a donation in the same amount to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. What's important here is not whether a president uses the fund or doesn't use the fund. What's important is to preserve the opportunity for the average American to have that speech and the opportunity to say loud and clear that they support clean, good, and fair elections. And my amendment, instead of eliminating the entire program, lets Americans make a donation out of their own pockets. Good government Americans make a donation out of their own pockets. Good government groups are against the underlying bill, such as the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, Democracy 21, Public Citizen, and rather than eliminating the public financing system, we should be working together in a bipartisan manner to reform it and improve it. Now, I understand that a point of order is being reserved against this bill because CBO has scored my amendment as saving only $400 million over 10 years. And while the underlying bill saves $600 million. And so I think that given that my bill does contribute to deficit reduction, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bath water. But understanding, Mr. Chairman, that a point of order has been reserved, I would ask that the amendment be withdrawn at this time.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the bill? The gentleman from Colorado. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Illinois.
I reserve a point of order against the amendment.
Point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. I rise today to discuss an amendment that can maintain our commitment to true democracy and reducing the corrupting influence of big money in presidential campaigns, but will also allow for the fiscal responsibility and the savings that members of both parties believe so strongly about. Rather than end the program, as has been proposed in the Republican bill to fund presidential elections and reduce the influence of big money on our political system, this amendment would make the source of the voluntary individual donations for the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. It can be structured in such a way where the same amount of money is saved, because rather than, and you know, when I looked into this matter, like many Americans, I thought that many people thought that the $3 checkoff was actually additional money you pay. On the tax form, it looks like it is. You check it off, and most people think it's additional. It's not actually an additional $3. It comes out of the money you already pay. So what this amendment would do is say it would actually be an optional amount on top of the other amount that you pay. So it would be an additional $3 or $5 or $10. We actually leave it open and allow people themselves to designate how much money they would like to apply to fighting big money in politics. So with this approach, we can separate these two issues. One is an issue of fiscal responsibility, with which I think there is a strong bipartisan support for making cuts, even cuts of programs that we hold dear. Frankly, I'm a supporter of public financing. I'm a co-sponsor of the Fair Elections Act. I support more public financing, but I'm also fiscally responsible. I would make cuts elsewhere. So let's separate that out and say we can save the $520 million we need to save, but allow the program of public financing to continue as a program that individuals themselves can choose how much to fund when they're filling out their taxes. And I think that that's a very critical component with regard to this. And by not capping the amount of voluntary donations, the amount of the fund could even be improved. It could remain solvent and strong because some taxpayers might dedicate $30, $100, $500. We would make it easy by empowering taxpayers to take on the moneyed interests. I do have a technical fix for the amendment that I would like to offer, and this is all happening so quick. We'll get that to you in a moment. But effectively, what this would do is as you know, as it's now structured, all the money is saved going forward, and the existing money from the fund is returned to the Treasury. The amendment, certainly my intent was to do the same thing, but there is some ambiguity about whether the existing money in the fund would be returned to the Treasury, which is the intent of the amendment. And I want to ask for unanimous consent to modify for a technical correction a copy of an amendment that I am sending to the desk.
Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman could send the modification to the desk, if you haven't done that already.
Okay. Thank the gentleman.
We need a copy of the modification is what I'm asking you.
It's on its way. If I can be recognized. Oh, no. We'll wait. Okay.
It's inconceivable to me that we would agree to something which is handwriting in our code.
Yeah, I think that's right. But let's see what you wrote down.
Read it quick as to read it. Then the chair will say to the objection, and you can reserve it. That way you'll never object.
If you want to buy yourself time, you can say reserving the right to object. Our side is going to need more time to read something that was written out.
While we're waiting for the thing at the desk, and the majority may have an objection to the gentleman's unanimous consent request, does the gentleman want to continue on his 5 minutes while we sort this out? Yeah.
So I will withdraw the request so I can continue with my time, and I inquire how much time remains.
Sure. You have 2.5 minutes.
Can you just write out the next 2.5 minutes? Okay. Okay. Well, so again, with regard to this amendment, it is designed to save the same amount of money. Because it does, obviously. It simply allocates the money both in the fund, and I offer, in terms of a clarification on legislative intent, that it is the intent. There's certainly nothing in the language of the amendment that precludes it, as well as any future funds that come in under the regular taxes that are paid, and allows for the fund in the future to be funded out of voluntary contributions. And I think if opponents of Presidential Campaign Fund want to end the program for budgetary purposes, my amendment gives a reason to maintain the fund. We can, if you believe in the mission of public financing and fighting big money interests, also be fiscally responsible by maintaining the fund. Eliminating the fund would continue the trend of shutting out the public's voice in federal campaigns. Now, again, I sympathize with the need to save $520 million, and I support the need to save $520 million, and that's a beginning. That's a small beginning for what we need to cut. But we can do so in a way that will allow this concept that was created in the wake of Watergate to continue to exist and work, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman is under the 5-minute rule, and you need to exhaust your 5 minutes.
Okay. I worry about the fate of our democracy with regard to the impact of big money on elections, and to get rid of public financing in presidential campaigns would inflict greater damage on our campaigns and on our democracy.
Now the gentleman's time's expired.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman from Illinois insist on his point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I do. I insist on the point of order and raise a point of order against the amendment because it violates Clause 10 of Rule 21, known as the cut-go rule. The amendment proposes increased mandatory spending without an equal or greater reduction in existing mandatory spending relative to the underlying bill in violation of the rule.
Any member wish to be heard on the point of order? Gentleman from Colorado?
Yes.
Gentleman's recognized to talk about the point of order.
The point of order is legitimate in the sense that there is an ambiguity with regard to what happens to the money. I would press the point that the legislative intent is to allow the money that exists in the fund to be returned to the Department of the Treasury. And we would be happy to work with the gentleman on a technical fix to the amendment that would make that clear. I would argue that it is already clear enough in the sense that it's certainly nothing is prohibited in terms of returning that money. The formal scoring came back as saving at least, I believe, $420 million, which is all the money going forward. So this is a question of the $100 million or so that is now in the fund. The legislative intent is to return that to the Treasury, which would therefore result in identical savings. And we would be happy to the gentleman's satisfaction and during the course of debate before the votes are called, clarify that through a technical fix.
Any other member wish to be heard on the point of order? Gentleman from California.
On the most recent clarification by the gentleman from Colorado, the intent of our legislation is to stop this program. Not only will the funds be returned that are already in there, but the program will not go forward. And so, therefore, the administrating cost to the IRS would be eliminated. The gentleman, by continuing the program, increases the net cost because you will continue having the administrative costs that otherwise would be no longer in effect as a result of the underlying bill. And therefore, the point of order would still be appropriate.
Any other member wish to be heard on the point of order? Chair